Hello and welcome to the Haaretz Podcast. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer. Since the birth of the State of Israel, American Jewish support for the state was a given, a fact of life, undebatable. Even during the rare moments of crises when U.S. interests and the interests of the Jewish state collided, the American Jewish community and its institutions were a bulwark of support that Israeli leaders knew they could depend on. Criticism, opposition, or outright hostility to Israel may have existed at the fringes of American Jewish life, but it was by and large too marginal to pose any kind of threat to the strength of the alliance between the two countries with the world's largest Jewish populations. But slowly, and then all at once, this has changed. American Jews can see and feel it all around them. Israelis and their leaders, not so much. A new study by two scholars reads like an attempt at a wake-up call for Israeli politicians and policymakers. Its title, American Jewry is Changing: What Israel Must Do to Preserve Its Partnership. The report was written before the Iran war began. An article by the same authors about the deterioration of Israel's standing in the U.S. overall after the Iran war is headlined, A Deepening Crisis in Israel's Standing in the United States. My guest on the podcast is one of the authors of the report and the article. Dr. Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis is a Ruderman Family Foundation Scholar in Residence, and he is a senior researcher at the Institute for National Security Studies at Tel Aviv University, where he heads the Israel-United States research field. The report was put out by the INSS. Dr. Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me, Allison.
Avishay, your report, co-authored by Ted Sasson, does two things. It describes and documents the reasons for the weakening of support for the state of Israel among American Jews, and then it offers policy recommendations for Israeli leaders aimed at attempting to correct course. Avishay, we regularly have researchers on this podcast from your institution, the Institute for National Security Studies. They talk about Gaza, Iran, Lebanon, the Gulf states, all kinds of serious security threats to Israel. Do you view a drop in support by American Jewry as a true threat to Israel's security?
The loss of the special relationship between Israel and the U.S. is something that will force Israel to reconsider its security priorities and how it carries out its security interests in every one of the areas you've just described. So yes, a significant change to how our relationship with the U.S. is structured is something that's going to matter greatly to the security and foreign policy of the state of Israel. And within that, the Jewish community over the decades has been a major pillar of that support. And the changes that are undergoing the community, parts of it are to do with declining support among certain sectors within the community. But more so than that, it's just the change in the environment in which the community exists, in which it operates. That's what we're actually documenting. The changes in public opinion are one part of it. Those are significant and important to Israeli foreign policy and security, which is why we started working on this issue at INSS.
Well, that was my question. Why now? Why is the time to look at this? This isn't a very new phenomenon. Why do you feel like it's reached a critical mass and needed to be addressed so thoroughly as it is in your report?
So two things have changed relatively recently. So at INSS, we've been sounding the alarm for a few years now that all was not well in the Israeli-U.S. relationship, even as unprecedented levels of support were coming in and backing and military engagement have crossed anything we've been familiar with. We've been seeing cracks in that facade for some time now. So this has been a matter of the last few years. And since October 7th, things have taken a turn for the worse. Among American Jewry, these are longer trends. This is not just one thing, but parts of these are coinciding and interacting with the broader changes in American public opinion, politics, society, to create a situation in which the American Jewish established community, the communal institutions, cannot function in the way they used to be able to function from an Israeli perspective. Now, I'm not talking about it from the perspective of an American Jew. I'm Israeli. They cannot continue to deliver the same sort of end-to-end support that is entirely uncontroversial within the community and within a broader American society that they used to be able to provide before. And post October 7th, and over the last 2.5 years of war, things have taken a turn for the worse in a lot of these respects.
And it seems like since the Iran war began, your research was conducted before Iran. It seems to have, excuse the expression, fallen off a cliff.
Yeah, so this lets us get a little into the data and what we're actually seeing. So, in American public opinion in general, and we've talked about this and we've written about this in Hebrew and in English, Israel is in the red in terms of net public support in every audience except older Republicans, even traditional audience that the current government, previous Israeli governments have seen as stalwart supporters of Israel. So I'm thinking white evangelicals, Republicans. We're seeing a drop in support. Republicans under the age of 50, fewer, around 60% view Israel negatively. The number goes up if you look at Republicans under the age of 30. White evangelicals under the age of 50 are 50 to 47 negative on Israel. And these are the audiences that are most outside the Jewish community, that are most positive towards Israel. So this is a poll by Pew that was conducted in March, so at the height of the war, but before gas prices hit $5 in most places. So we've seen this break, and within it, the Jewish community is still more supportive of Israel, but follows a lot of the same patterns.
So until now, we've really been talking about a partisan crisis in support for Israel in terms of, you've written that it used to sort of balance itself out. There was less and less support for Israel among Democrats and more among Republicans, so things sort of even out. But what we're describing here, or what your statistics seem to be describing here, is less of a partisan crisis than a generational crisis.
Right. So somewhere we've described this as a generational cliff. There's a whole generation that doesn't have the same sort of experiences. It's highly polarized. It has experienced one of the strongest accelerants of these trends and other trends as well, which is the change in media environment and technology. This is the generation of social media, and the collapse of established sources of authority is affecting that as well. It's also fueling a rise in anti-Semitism, also leading to some of our thinking that has gone into this report that we're discussing today. And all of these have led to a moment where, yes, there's a difficult situation among Democrats at large. Democrats don't view Israel positively, and this has been going on for some time. But across the board, among young Americans, views of Israel are just negative for various reasons.
So, focusing on American Jewry, your study separates the factors of what is happening inside the Jewish community and the reasons there for the drop. And again, what we were just talking about, how it's being influenced by overall attitudes towards Israel in the United States. So, can you talk about the internal factors for a moment inside the community? You describe how the community is weakening as a whole and that its support for Israel is eroding. Are those two things interconnected?
It's very likely that they are. This is the sort of thing that you can't prove. It's not like we've seen one thing fall and the other thing go up. But at the same time, but what we see is that internally, when we talk about the community weakening, what we're actually talking about is the traditional communal institution. It's not that there are not other forms of meaningful communal life, but the old establishment of communal Jewry has changed. So what does that look like? First, there's a push to the edges. The American Jewish community has been growing over the years. If you remember this conversation, if we were sitting here 15 years ago, we'd be worried about a crisis of assimilation and what's going to happen to the Jewish people as a whole in the U.S. What we're seeing is actually that the American Jewish community has grown since that moment of fear. But the way it has grown has been a sort of religious polarization. On the one hand, you've got a growing sector of unidentified or unaffiliated Jews, many of them the children of families where one of the parents is Jewish, the other might not be, or the parents are culturally Jewish in some way, but don't identify strongly as with any one of the denominations. And so they also don't belong to the traditional structures that American Jews have been affiliated with, shuls, temples, synagogues, JCCs, federations, all of these other structures. And on the other end of things, what we see is a growing sector of younger Orthodox, especially ultra-Orthodox, the Haredi part of the community, not so much the modern Orthodox. And that's kind of crowding out the old middle of liberal American Jewry. That is also very strongly affiliated. At the same time, the institutions have been relying on a shrinking pool of donors. So they're still bringing in quite a bit of the resources, and even more so that they were able to bring in the past, but it's coming from singular foundations. It's coming from bigger donors, not the same small money, small dollar donors that they were able to rely on in the past. And those things have caused kind of a weakening of the institutional center. And that institutional center has been part of the way in which American Jewry is organized around its support for Israel. And as you get younger American Jews who are not as affiliated with the community or dissociate with some of the positions that the community has taken, including in support of recent Israeli governments that have been out of lockstep in their view with where they are ideologically and where they are politically, then they become disassociated and disaffiliated with these institutions, and the ability of those institutions to speak to younger American Jews becomes strained. On top of all of that, and this is, I'll end with this, I'll finish with this point for now, those younger American Jews are younger Americans. And so they're undergoing many of the same trends. If you're today a young American Jew who is not very strongly affiliated with Israel to begin with, then the experience that you've had either on campus or where you work or on social media is one that causes you to wonder whether it's worth it for you socially, morally. I want to respect people's opinions on this, to identify with Israel. And it makes it more difficult for them to support Israel. And so we see in a community survey after community survey, a lower level of identification with the idea of Zionism or the support for the state of Israel. And what we don't see, but kind of balancing it out, people still care about the idea of Jewish nationhood. The Jewish people should have some sort of national home. But the concrete idea or the concrete translation of that into Israel and into support for Israeli policy and ability to build and carry out its necessary needs, that is wearing thinner.
And, getting into the politics of it all, it's hard for American Jews who identify as liberal, non-Orthodox Jews to connect to a country that's under a government that doesn't seem to recognize or respect them.
Right. So in the course of conducting this study, so we previously we talked about what does it look like in terms of the internal processes that American Jewry is undergoing. But a lot of this, and this is something we emphasize in the report, has to do or has a part, Israel has had a part in. And one of the major things that we've learned in these conversations that we've had with the leaders and communal organizers, we talked about 50 people both in Israel and in the US in building this study, apart from collecting data and looking at other studies and surveys, is that they feel like Israel is not listening to them, is not interested in their opinions, even as they are increasingly affected by Israeli actions on the ground. And there's also quite a bit of sediment from previous Israeli decisions around questions. The two major issues are the judicial overhaul / reform, where American Jewry is by and large, I think most of your listeners know this, most of our readers don't, is 70%, grosso modo, liberal and then 30% more conservative. Those 70% pretty much had fallen in or saw the judicial reform in the same way that the Israeli opposition saw it. And so the government's insistence on passing it didn't sit well with American Jewry. And then on top of that is the older but still fresh and painful memory of decisions by this government and previous right-wing governments in Israel around questions of religious pluralism and liberalism. So as we said, American Jewry is not Orthodox in its core. And the way Israel thinks about American Jewry's prayer practices, the stepping back from the Kotel Compromise in a previous Netanyahu government, that continues to be a painful and sore spot. The interaction or the sort of relationship that the current Israeli government has built with certain right-wing forces in the world is also not set well with many in the American Jewish community. So a few years ago, Israel hosted a conference on anti-Semitism and invited right-wing figures that global Jewry, but American Jewry in particular, considered beyond the pale. ADL ended up deciding not to, ADL and other organizations, not just ADL. I was recently in South Africa. The South African Jewish community, which is much more Orthodox and close to Israel, decided to not show up and ended up coming to meet with the Israeli president instead. So there has been a growing sense that at least recent Israeli governments have not been attentive, have not been respectful for the American Jewish way of being. And that is also straining the relationship. And in this case, not just the relationship with the younger Jewish community, but also the established Jewish community and people who are looking for ways to engage with Israel, remain committed to Israel, remain supportive of Israel, but are finding it difficult or finding the relationship not reciprocated on the Israeli official side.
Yeah, anti-Semitism is an interesting place because it used to be that obviously that was one spot in which interests were aligned, right? Both American Jewry and Israel wanted to fight growing global anti-Semitism, but increasingly it seems that diaspora Jewry and Israel are at odds over it, not only because, inviting right-wing figures to it or Israeli government overly allying with anti-immigrant, borderline racist parties and politics because they are, pro-Israel. They, to put it bluntly, hate Muslim immigration in their countries more than they are anti-Semitic. But what's interesting is that in American Jewry, they see Israel's actions of fanning the flames of anti-Semitism. While they may not blame Israel wholeheartedly for anti-Semitism itself, they do feel like Israel takes actions without taking into consideration its effect on their lives and their safety. So it seems for the first time, at least in my memory, that it feels like Israel and American Jewry are not necessarily on the same side when it comes to concern about anti-Semitism.
So I wouldn't want to overstate it. There's some truth to this. There's certainly a feeling among some folks that for Israel, anti-Semitism isn't always seen as a genuine concern, but at least for some in Israel, not for Israel as a whole. There are many people in Israel who are genuinely concerned about this, working on it in a variety of ways and dimensions, but that there are those in Israel for whom this is a useful way of doing international and in national politics. So that's to some degree true. I think actually since October 7th, that gap has shrunk a bit. So if previously that was the case, I think the growing salience of anti-Semitism in the US, including on the American right, where we see the return of out and out anti-Semitic tropes and dog whistles, has made the alignment of interest a little clearer. Those are places where if Tucker Carlson or if Candace Owens is speaking against Israel and speaking against Jews in the same conversation, that reduces the strain to some degree. And I think even this is both anecdotal evidence, but also some harder evidence. Here, maybe I can give a measure of personal experience. What's been going on university campuses is something where the distance between Israel and at least parts of the Jewish liberal community have shrunken a bit. So we've written about this. There's ambivalence among American Jewry that is not quite understood to Israelis. We wanted to communicate to Israelis why that ambivalence existed about the current administration's actions against academia on the basis of anti-Semitism, but it's not because liberal American Jews or some in the liberal community don't feel the same concerns. I was at Harvard. I was teaching back on October 2023, and while my own experience was great and the university supported me when I went back to see where I can help in those first few tumultuous weeks, the overall experience that folks had on campus, and at this point there's been a report spearheaded by Jewish leaders on campus, many of them very liberal, and in the past have gotten critique over their Israel positions that they weren't pro-Israel enough, that outline a pattern of ostracization and certain treatment of Jewish and Israeli students that isn't what we would like to see on American campuses. And so I think in that respect, the distance has shrunken to some degree, and Harvard was far from the worst place. There had been places that were much worse than Harvard. Harvard tends to get a lot of press because it's Harvard, but it was really not the worst. Some places in the UC system, Columbia, other places that even are smaller liberal arts colleges haven't been great on this, let's say it that way. And so I think in those places we've seen a narrowing of the difference. But at the same time, Israel, and this is where we get to some of our recommendations, Israel doesn't really, it's one of the only IHRA signatories that doesn't have a national anti-Semitism strategy. We think one needs to be in place, and it can't be one that just says wherever you see a mole, whack it. It needs to be one that takes into account both what a state actor like Israel can do to sustain and support communities that are facing growing anti-Semitism, but also reckon with the fact that sometimes things Israel does, occasionally things Israel justifiably does and has to do, but still things Israel does help out anti-Semites who would otherwise still be doing what they're doing, but this is fanning some of the flames. And so we think that's one of our recommendations and the ways we have been thinking about this, because when we move to our recommendations, what we've really focused on is what Israel can do. We're not looking to tell American Jews what to do with their lives. We're thinking about the ways in which, because this is an Israeli interest, whether on the moral reason, on the political reason, on the cultural reason, for many reasons, Israel has a strong interest in a strong American Jewish community, what Israel can do to help.
It's been a big deal over the years that Israel is a co-funder of Birthright, Taglit in Hebrew, that brings young American Jews to Israel. And in your recommendations, you recommend beefing up both Birthright and other Israel study programs. There's a chicken and an egg there, though. You have to have the American Jewish community, the young American Jewish community, and their parents encourage them to go on these programs and travel to Israel. So presumably they can see more of the nuances of the situation than take a hard pro or anti-Israel position. I mean, previously, Birthright was viewed as some sort of magic bullet, that it was going to transform young American Jews into more identified with their Judaism and supporting Israel. So the recommendations say that you think that it really works. That you think one of the problems is that these programs have been cut back in recent years and that they need to be revitalized.
Well, it's the closest thing to a magic bullet if what you care about is Jewish identification and a relationship with Israel that can be complicated, but still a relationship with Israel nonetheless. So data shows, and this is not just a feeling, it's one of the areas where we have the best data and the best social science work, and it consistently shows that people who have gone on Birthright compared to people who have applied to Birthright but didn't get in. So we're not comparing it to just any baseline. This is as close as you can get to comparing apples to apples, have been more likely to marry a Jewish spouse, to raise their kids in some form of Judaism, not necessarily any prescriptively one form or another, remain engaged with Israel, even as they remain liberal. And so I think that's been as close to proven as we can have any social fact, to prove any social fact. And the numbers have gone down significantly. So if we're looking at the 5 years before the pandemic, about 230,000 participants in Birthright, and 60 to 70% of those are American Jews. That number has shrunken by more than half to 80,000 in the subsequent 5 years, so 2020 to 2024. And that's due both to the pandemic and then the war. So right now, what's stopping us from getting to a significant number of folks who are coming to Taglit, and we'll say in a second, I'll come back to what happens on these trips, because I know that especially among younger American Jews, folks my age and younger, the trip and the program has gotten a lot of criticism over what it shows and doesn't show and what it attempts to educate to. But right now, we're not at a point where we're meeting demand. Even if you think demand has shrunk, it has not shrunk to this degree. So we think that that's one element. But one thing that we've done and we've said in our recommendations is we shouldn't think of these recommendations as piecemeal. So one thing that people will often say when they talk about this thing is, like, we have to do better hasbara. We have to make the case stronger. We have to send more Israelis on camps. I don't know. Things that are in the what we would professionally call the public diplomacy space. And we do have some thoughts on what needs to happen in the public diplomacy space, but two things on this. One is we think that it's not going to be one thing. There's no silver bullet.
Okay, what are the most important policy recommendations? If you had 5 minutes with the top leadership of the State of Israel, and you could push one or two of your recommendations as a must-do now because we're in a crisis, what would you tell them?
Yeah, and I will say one of our advantages as INSS, given that we exist in the security space, is that we often have these 5 minutes. And so we get to have these conversations, and we are already having these conversations about the state of U.S.-Israel relationship and the role of American Jewry within it. And I would say looking for regions: diplomacy, education, political representation and voice, and planning and funding. And when you think about the Israeli role and what it can do to sustain American Jewry, the first thing Israel has to do is rebuild and reconfigure how it's perceived in American politics in general, and among the Jewish community in particular. And that can't be just a story of rhetoric and presentation. This is also a story of policy. The fact that Israel, at this point, for its own reasons, and Israelis can decide to pay the price of this position. But there is a real price, and we have to face it. The fact that Israel is saying that it is not seeking any negotiated settlement that requires it to scale back military operations, especially in the Palestinian area, is something that is functioning as an upper limit on the ability to perceive Israel positively in the broader U.S. Public and among the Jewish community as well. Especially in the Jewish community, folks are looking, and I can say this with authority, we have gotten together leaders of these Jewish organizations and listened to them and talked to them and had a frank conversation with them again at INSS. And what we're hearing is we need to have some positive outlook about what it is that you think Israel can do and is willing to do, even if you don't think you can do what everybody in America would love you to do. We have to have something that is still a positive description of this. And we're seeing some willingness to accept this among some Israeli leaders. But it's whether or not that's the case, we're still going to say that it's necessary. So that's one piece of it.
Don't you get pushback saying that we're elected to lead Israel the way that Israelis want us to lead and enact policies that Israelis want us to enact? And why should we take into consideration the situation of diaspora Jews and the attitudes of diaspora Jews? And how should that be taken into consideration in a democratic state where we answer to our voters? I mean, how seriously do Israeli leaders take what you're saying? Do they really view it as a wake-up call, or are they brushing it aside?
The fact that they're looking at the numbers in the American public as a whole is serving as a wake-up call for many of them. Many of them were already open to this sort of conversation before. They might feel constrained about their ability to move on it, but very few have dismissed it out of hand. Where we do see a dismissal of it is among a certain kind of public opinion maker and opinion writer, where we've seen over the last few weeks, and even a few Israeli diplomats who have written off large parts of the American Jewish community. And that's not our position. And leaders that we talk to don't hold that position either. What we're trying to get them to see, and this is where we're coming from as INSS, this goes back to the beginning of our conversation, is we're not coming at it from the point of view of Jewish people. As much as I might value it personally, as much as I might have personal connections to American Jewry, which I do, I'm married to somebody who was born in the States and moved to Israel. I spent a good chunk of time here in the States. And so as much as that is the case, we're making the argument from the point of view of Israeli security and national interest. This is our mandate. And this is where we're coming from. And what we're telling Israeli leaders, and we're finding them attentive to it. I truly believe that. They might be restricted in their ability to act on that, but they do hear us. And when we're coming to them and we're telling them, Israel is going to have a problem if it loses the American Jewish community as a significant base of support in the U.S. for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is if you think you have a problem in the Democratic Party with 70% of Jews in the Democratic Party, that serves as an anchor for support for Israel within the party. Imagine how bad the case was if Democratic public officials didn't feel beholden to some part of their electorate that felt strongly about this issue. So if you only care about that, you should care about American Jewry. So one recommendation is diplomacy. The other is education. And then in terms of, I'll skip planning and funding for now, but I want to say something about politics, which speaks to that last question you asked me. What we recommend is not that American Jews get a vote in Israel. They're not citizens. If American Jews would like to get an actual vote, they need to either make Aliyah, naturalize, they need to become part of the polity. But they have a stake, and that stake needs to be respected because what we do affects American Jewry significantly, especially today, more so than in previous years. In any time in my memory, American Jews are affected both through anti-Semitism and anti-Israelism when Israel operates in ways that are in discord with some of their needs. And at the end of the day, Israel can do so, but it needs to listen. And the other thing is, American Jews also contribute. They care deeply. And so we benefit from listening to American and to global Jewry more generally. American Jewry is just the biggest diaspora, except for Israel. So in that respect, we think that there's actually a lot to be gained, but also a good reason to be listening and consulting with American Jewry.
In the real world of politics, this deterioration has worsened under Israeli government, a coalition that relies on the support of ultra-Orthodox parties and extreme far-right parties with deep ideological conviction, I think that, far overrides any concern about what American Jews think, or frankly, what Americans think about Israeli policy. Realistically, do you think the current leaders of Israel stand any chance of honoring, acknowledging, implementing any of these policy recommendations? It's a very short now tenure of the existing coalition. Or is your report sort of a blueprint for if this current coalition is replaced by one maybe more amenable or caring more about what American Jews think, that they have kind of a roadmap to do it? Do you think that, there's any chance that if the current leadership of Israel remains in place, that your recommendations will be taken seriously?
Some might, but honestly, as a whole, it's not likely that as a package, this will get passed and thought of significantly. And I think even if some of them do feel a sense of concern, it is overridden by what they view as either their or Israel's political interest. And I respect that. I disagree with it, but I respect that. We're still committed to what we think. We're not looking to write what we think this government thinks and carry it out. Some elements of it could be incorporated. I think there are parts of it that could happen either way. But yes, I think a government that sees this as a major concern will be more likely to act on it. And we're trying to make that resource available to such a government or to such decision makers, or at least float this into the Israeli conversation in a way that allows it to be meaningfully considered among other considerations. If we only achieve that, that's already, in our view, quite a bit of progress on the issue.
Well, we'll leave that on an optimistic note. Dr. Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, thank you so much for coming on the podcast and talking to us. And I hope that your report makes an impact and is taken seriously as it deserves to be taken.
Thank you very much, Allison.
And that's it for this episode of the Haaretz Podcast. Thanks to my guest, Dr. Avishay Ben Sasson-Gordis, and producer and editor, Dan Brumer. If you'd like to keep listening to the podcast and make sure you never miss an episode, please subscribe to us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please leave us a 5-star rating, and that way more people can find us. And to keep up with all the latest news on Israel, the Middle East, and the Jewish world, don't forget to subscribe to and follow Haaretz.com. I'm Allison Kaplan-Summer, and until next time, shalom from Tel Aviv.